Hello. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I'm going to do 1,000 questions reduced to one, how to win the authorship question. So obviously it's a big claim. And when I'm talking about how to win the authorship question, I'm talking about in the public square, in mainstream media, in conversations with people you know, and in academia, not in closed specialist conferences. Okay, so when I talk about how to win the argument, I obviously don't mean this kind of argument, although I know sometimes the level of argument is a little bit like this. I mean, of course, a logical, reasoned, evidence-based case that might persuade the persuadable that there are good reasons to doubt the authorship of Shakespeare's works. And I believe it has to be a two-stage process. So the first stage is, I should have this on my thing, but I don't. Essentially, establish the question. Establish the question as a valid question. And then, with that established, go to stage two. So the first stage is knocking in the pitons. The second stage is climb the mountain. The reason why I think it has to be a two-stage process is because you introduce another level of resistance if you're arguing for a single candidate. Okay, so there's already resistance to the idea that it's not Shakespeare of Stratford, but if you're then promoting a single candidate, you're introducing another layer of resistance plus some easy dismissals. So, you know, among my friends, the Oxfordians, you know, there's easy dismissals for both the Marlovian and the Oxfordian case, and people who are not aware of the complexities of the case of just say, the Earl of Oxford died in 1604, Marlowe died in 1593, end of story, right? And we don't always have the opportunity to put forward the complexities of it. They're not going to listen straight away. Stage one is where we are at. In these rooms, we can indulge the further research, all right? But out there in the public square, we're at stage one. It is still the authorship question, not the authorship solution. Only when we have effectively unseated the incumbent will there be a possibility of real, genuinely open inquiry into how these works were created. I'd like to cover very quickly, I hope it's quick enough for you, my journey into the authorship question, which you'll see is relevant to my approach. I began with a science degree, putting things under the microscope. I became a computer programmer, which relies on logic. And since childhood, I've been a creative writer, poems, a couple of plays, stories, novels. So there's that imaginative capacity and my ability to understand the writing from the inside, the writing process from the inside. And 18 years ago, I applied to study for a PhD in creative writing. I was looking for a big idea. It was 2005, and I turned on the TV, and very fortuitously, Professor Jonathan Bate, in this excellent documentary by Mike Rubbo, which explores Christopher Marlowe as the author of Shakespeare's works, kindly gave me the idea to write a novel about the authorship question. Thank you, Professor Bate. Right, I had had no exposure to the authorship question at this time. My mum was a massive Shakespeare fan. I called Rosalind from As You Like It. I always resisted the push to get into Shakespeare. I had to study some plays in the process of my education. And I kind of enjoyed them, but I was pushing it away because it was my mum's thing. And then I started, well, I had to get to know the works inside out. And I wanted to read, you know, the biographies of both Marlowe and Shakespeare to make this fiction work. And as I started to read at the University of Sussex, This is what I found myself scribbling in the margins again and again, so often that I just reduced it to the code WYE. Where's your evidence? Where is it? Again and again, scribbling in the margins of books that I owned, scribbling in my notebooks if it was a library book with a page reference. Where's your evidence? It was driving me crazy. I was really shocked to discover just how shaky the foundations of this monolith were, and also how poor much of the scholarship around Shakespeare was. Where, for example, a very respected scholar like Lucas Erne could demonstrate decisively that what had long been called Chattel's apology to Shakespeare could not, by pure logic, have been directed to Shakespeare. And he could show this decisively and still be ignored because that logic didn't suit the dominant narrative, which he knew very well, as you'll see from that quote. In his biography of Shakespeare, Dennis Kay wrote that the Shakespeare myth has its own vitality, its own self-sustaining energy, a point which the reception history of Chattel's apology forcefully supports. For over 2 centuries, the myth has effortlessly kept alive Malone's misinterpretation and stifled any attempts to question it. He knew this was a difficult sell. And if you Google Chattel's apology, all this time later, 2020 is, this website comes up at the very top of the Google search, Kind Heart's Dream, Chattel's apology to Shakespeare. So 22 years later, no change. In fact, he pointed out in his paper, he was the 4th person to publish in an academic journal to show that Chattel's apology was not to Shakespeare, but still the myth prevails. And from a seemingly very authoritative source, Shakespeare Documented, which was essentially set up in order to combat the authorship question and is sponsored, among others, by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. But that's what people in the public arena are going to see if they Google Chattel's apology. It's still to Shakespeare. The problem is that many people find it impossible when it comes to the authorship of the works to adhere to the principles of good scholarship as explained here by Giles Dawson. The scholar has no axes to grind. He is not eager to prove his own hypotheses correct, but rather to find out whether they are correct or not. When he uncovers a fact that does not square with his hypothesis, he neither shuts his eyes to it, nor tries to explain it away, nor trims it to fit his own preconceptions. In presenting the results of his research, he will distinguish carefully between demonstrable fact and tentative conjecture, never building on the latter, and by full and sound documentation will furnish the reader with the means of testing both conjecture and stated fact. The problem is that many people find this impossible when it comes to the authorship of the works. And I started to wonder, what's going on inside their skulls? I mean, are they nuts? Well, these are, but in fact, they're just being people. People as studied by the social scientists, Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson, authors of the book, Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. It's a great book. They explain how self-justification and the desire not to be wrong leads people to get more and more entrenched in their positions. Say you take a position, right? That's choice 1. You're at the top of the pyramid. That's you and your, maybe your best friend, your mother, who knows? Mother. You're at the top of the pyramid and you make a choice. You make a choice to make a statement. Maybe, you don't believe that it's Shakespeare of Stratford, they do, right? And you argue it once and you're like one level down, you're slightly committed, right? And then you engage with someone on the internet and you come another, you're a little bit more committed to your argument or whatever detail of your argument you're doing. And they're a little bit more committed to theirs. And so it goes, right? The more you commit to your position, the further apart you get from your opponent until your differences are irreconcilable, right? And what's happening here is that confirmation bias leads you further and further down your own theoretical rabbit hole. And as the distance between your position and your opponent's position grows, so does your cognitive dissonance. Okay, now cognitive dissonance is very painful. Most people will go to great lengths to avoid it, including calling your opponents conspiracy theorists, mocking them, or just completely ignoring them. What Thomas Kuhn said about scientific paradigms in the structure of scientific revolutions, and what Max Planck said here about science, is true of the humanities too. It's true of all areas of human knowledge because of our tendency to be prey to confirmation bias and through our strong desire not to admit we were wrong. All of this study, this was all part of my PhD, led up to the completion of my PhD, a little index there of the critical component, and the Marlowe papers, which was the creative component. So it was the Marlowe paper, 70,000 words, and a 50,000 word thesis, an overlength PhD, because I didn't want to do a disservice and only have 20,000 words to just explore the authorship question. So I got special permission to go overlength. The Marlowe papers was what led me to being invited to Stratford for an event to launch the new book of Professor Sir Stanley Wells and Dr. Paul Edmondson, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. A live event followed by a webinar. And I was so nervous about going head to head with these two eminent Stratfordians that I did a great deal of debate prep. I've watched The West Wing. I actually got someone to play them. First time I failed miserably. I went away, I did more homework, I came back, we did it again. Right. So I basically wanted to weigh up all the evidence. All the evidence that they were going to use, how would I counter it? What arguments was I going to make? How were they going to counter that? How would I counter their counter? I made so many cards. I just worked on so much. I literally spent months as soon as it was booked preparing for it. What were my strengths? What were their weaknesses? And after the event, I turned that debate prep into this electronic tome, Shakespeare the Evidence. And this is where we get to the 1,000 questions of my talk. There aren't 1,000 in it yet, but there's easily 1,000 planned. It's still waiting to be completed when I have a moment. But I certainly got through quite a few of them. But these 1,000 questions we might ask or be asked, and how we or they might counter them. Now, you're not meant to read the text on the following slides, but it's just to give you a sense of what's covered for those who don't know the book. I know some of you are readers of it, have it. A scope of some of those 1,000 questions from the current index of Shakespeare the Evidence. Okay, so we have evidence. Shakespeare of Stratford was a shareholder and actor, the basics. The whole book is really about the writer, but we get that established. Arguments against the authorship question. Stratfordian arguments, direct references to William Shakespeare. Stratfordian arguments, disputed and posthumous references to William Shakespeare. Well, they don't dispute them, but I do. We do. Evidence the author was from Warwickshire and the Midlands. Evidence the author had specialist knowledge, which is argued to rule out alternative candidates. Evidence used to argue the author didn't travel, of course, we're very familiar with those. Evidence of collaborative writing that would rule out a hidden author. And then we get to that's not complete, of course. None of it is complete yet, but non-Stratfordian arguments. So evidence of hidden authors generally and specifically relating to allusions to the Shakespeare works. The author's specialist knowledge, starting with university language, with some geographical knowledge, very partial entries there. Still to come, foreign language sources, law, noble pursuits, music is another one I have to add to the list. And then anomalies, publications. So Paul Edmondson said to me once, what anomalies? Publications, anomalies on the Stratford Monument, references, life-work mismatch, anomalies in the plays, poems, personal writerly collections, artifacts, etc. Now, I became aware once this was online that it was only being read by people, it's preaching to the choir, right? So it was only being read by people who already doubted the authorship, and it was being used as a resource, and it was helpful, and that's great, but I wanted to reach a wider audience. So I actually wrote a book intended for a mainstream audience, but I wanted a mainstream high-profile publisher, and my agent wouldn't even send it out. He was a bit worried I was going to ruin my career as a novelist. So I changed agents, and he also wouldn't send it out. Okay, that's 2014. In 2016, just on a whim, actually, one day when I was quite angry, I decided that I would publish it in installments on a website, which came to be known. This wasn't the original title of the book, but the website became Bardley True. I called it Bardley True. I've only put the first few chapters of the book up there because I'd got a little way into it. As usual, got distracted by other things I needed to do. And then suddenly I got the opportunity to produce the world's first MOOC, massive open online course on the authorship question, financed by my university. They asked for ideas. We want to put a MOOC out with Goldsmiths, University of London on it. We'll pay money for it to be professionally filmed. And I went, yeah, I've got an idea. And I used the manuscript of the book as the basis for the course. So I had the material there, and then I just had to break it up into little bite-sized chunks and film it. I say just, it took quite a long time. We've had over 15,000 people enroll in this course to date. Some of them are in this room. Some people have said that was their way in to the authorship question. So that, you know, the manuscript for the book and trying to reach people, that's worked on some level reasonably well. I mean, it's accessible with video content. So some of the people, though, who enrolled on the course, especially in the first few months, were well, the Oxfordian contingent, some very angry Stratfordians, very annoyed at the sponsorship, wrote to my head of department saying I was bringing the university into disrepute. They got Stanley Wells to do it, actually, because he had some clout, you know, trying to get me into trouble. But it's okay. University stood by me. But they raised the questions they think are their strongest points, as well as attacking some of our weakest points. Now, all of these experiences of both going broad and deep into the evidence and the arguments have taught me the strengths and weaknesses of our position in the public square, and has helped me to formulate my theory of how we might actually win this argument. Yes, the Max Planck thing, just through people dying, that's also going to work, but I like to speed it up if I can. I kind of would like me not to be one of the people that's dead by the time this is accepted as a valid question in academia. So I want the celebratory dinner, you know. I don't think it's going to be a single moment. It's not going to be a Berlin Wall. But we see some crumbling already. I see crumbling. Okay, so remember this representation of how confirmation bias and self-justification leaves us miles apart from our opponent's position with no common ground? When we allow ourselves to be convinced that something is true, confirmation bias ensures that we will read the evidence accordingly, and we become prey to the same errors of thinking as die-hard Stratfordians. So sure, ask what's going on in their skulls for sure, but also what's going on in yours. Don't risk coming across as a nut. The very first step you must take if you want to win the argument with, well, everyone that you know and might communicate with is escape the cult of your belief. And yes, cult. I know it's a strong word. I actually know that this whole section coming up is going to offend some people in this room, possibly upset them. I love you all. I just want to say right from the outset, I really do. You're all my friends. You might try and make me your enemy, but you are my friends. As far as I'm concerned, this is nothing personal. This is all about just putting our best foot forward. Now, if you're not sure if you're at cult levels of belief, you can ask yourself the questions devised by Megan Phelps Roper. Roper was raised in an actual cult. Her family are members of the Westboro Baptist Church, and that's where she was raised. Okay. Now, she'd zealously embraced the beliefs of the Westboro Baptist Church. She left after conversations with strangers on Twitter, and she learned about the power of engaging the other. She had people engaging her, and it changed her mind. She'd been raised in this cult from a baby. She was holding signs saying, God hates fags, when she couldn't even read what was on them, when she was like 4 or 5 years old. So pretty hard to escape that level of indoctrination, but she did it. Okay, so from her experiences, she's formulated a number of questions we would all benefit from asking ourselves, and possibly quite regularly, right? Because beliefs get established and hardened, and then new ones get established. All right, so am I capable of entertaining real doubts about my beliefs, or am I operating from a place of certainty? Can I articulate the evidence I would need to see in order to change my position, or is my perspective unfalsifiable? Can I articulate my opponent's position in a way they'd recognize, or am I straw manning? Now, this is a great one for the Stratfordians because they love straw manning. This is a particularly irritating one from 2014, I think. The campaign to prove Shakespeare didn't exist. Who's saying that? Not us, right? But don't fall prey to the same errors. Okay. Am I attacking ideas or attacking the people who hold them? Now, that's obviously something we are all aware of. Ad hominem attacks are their main defense because they don't really have many good ones. So the first port of call is to call us conspiracy theorists, lunatics, etc. Right? So they're doing that, but we shouldn't do it too. Okay. I have heard non-Stratfordians accuse Stratfordian scholars of being liars, purely motivated by money and status. And I think they're largely just as sincere about their position as we are. I think they truly, truly believe it. They think it's fact, it's reality. They don't think of it as a theory. Okay. And so, we're creating cognitive dissonance by poking their reality, wobbling their podium. It's upsetting, and that's why they're angry. They're sincere. So just, yeah. And I hope we haven't come to this. I hope we haven't. I think we sometimes experience that a little bit on the other side, but cutting off close relationships with people who disagree with me, particularly over relatively small points of contention. And I also hope you can say no to this one. Am I willing to use extraordinary means against people who disagree with me, e.g. forcing people out of their jobs or homes? Now, we're not in a position to do that because we're not in the position of power, right? They are, and they try that. Bill and I have both had threats of various kinds. Bill Leahy, who's was the other UK out academic, now moved to Ireland. So, yeah. Now, Megan Phelps Roper also has 4 tips for talking with people you disagree with. So, first of all, don't assume bad intent. It cuts us off from understanding why someone thinks as they do. Ask questions. Map the disconnect between the differing points of view by asking questions. It's actually so much more effective than making your case at them, lecturing at them. And it's so easy when you're passionate, it's so easy. And I do it all the time. Go too much, too deep, too far, ask them questions. Ask them questions. Stay calm. Can be difficult. I've had practice, but it's really powerful. It's really very powerful, especially when they're getting angry. And if there's an audience, if there's people watching that, they see you, the calm person, they see them, the angry person. The calm person has all the power and all the authority. And you can also think much more clearly when you're not triggered, you know? But do make the argument. Make the argument. And this is where we're going into really how to win the argument, what points to make when you only have a very short window sometimes just to lay it out with someone. You don't want to be that person, that intense person who gives them the whole spiel and they walk off, you know. Focus on the question, not the answer. I know I'm slightly repeating myself, but it is a question. Keep it a question. You know, in-line and in-person discussions, single author solutions, they just create more resistance, distractions, you go down rabbit holes, you know, and these easy dismissals that I mentioned earlier. For clarity, keep an open mind and don't dismiss the cases for other candidates out of hand the way that the Stratfordians do. All right. Unity is required at stage 1. Stage 2, we can all break up and fisticuffs. Well, hopefully we'll still be friends. But, you know, stage 1, we need to pull together to unseat the incumbent. You can't have infighting, right? You have infighting. This is where, you know, we lose all our power in that. And they're always trying divide and conquer. They do a lot of that. One of their arguments is the more candidates you have, the less valid the question is. It's like, no, the more candidates, the more people are aware that the Stratford man's not adequate and they're looking for solutions. But, you know, don't let them divide us. And the other thing about this is, you know, open curiosity is essential at this stage. Keep an open mind as much as you possibly can. I know it's a challenge sometimes. Lean on group authorship. This is our open door. 10 years ago, it wasn't even a thing. They wouldn't accept it. Now it's orthodoxy. In a decade, it's orthodoxy that, you know, easily a third of the plays in the first folio have got many hands. This is our gently open door. Push it gently. Allow it. We don't know. We don't have the holograph manuscripts. We don't know who was involved in doing changes at any stage before they get kind of nailed down in the folio, right? So lean on it, embrace it, but do not take the claims of computational stylistics at face value. You know, I've done some work on this from my computing background. I'm just going to share 2 slides from a different talk that I did for the Marlowe Society. Can computers find Marlowe in Shakespeare? One of the main algorithms they use is something called Zeta. And genre skews the results of Zeta so strongly. An out-of-genre play like The Jew of Malta throws up this ridiculous situation where they say it's 35% Marlowe's, 25% Shakespeare's, and nearly a half of it, we're not really sure. Was it like 40% of it? Don't know who wrote that. And here's another kind of fact from that talk. The Zeta submethod used to detect Marlowe's style in Henry VI, Part 1, cannot detect Hamlet as Shakespeare's. So what kind of method is that? Not a very good one. All right. So don't let people blind you with maths. It's pseudoscience. I'm telling you now, it's pseudoscience. Okay, how else to win? This is where you lose a few people. Drop weak arguments, even if you're very attached to them. In creative writing, there's a phrase called murder your darlings, murder your darlings. We have to maintain the highest possible standards of scholarship, right? Like a woman operating in a man's world. We have to be 10 times as good as the traditional scholars in order to be heard and taken seriously. We have to be rigorous with ourselves, okay? So drop the weak arguments. I'm just going to give you 3 that I think everyone should drop. You're not going to like it. Drop the idea from Richard Paul Rose, fantastic book on Italy, that the author of Romeo and Juliet wrote about a grove of sycamores at Verona's West Gate because they existed at that time and he'd seen them on his travels. All right? The trees outside Verona's West Gate are not sycamores. They're plane trees. They have a distinctive bark. Okay, the leaves look similar, but they're plane trees. They were planted 40 to 50 years ago in the 1980s. Now, maybe there's always been trees on that site. We don't know. All right, this is not a strong argument. And not only that, from a 16th century engraving of Verona, it shows no trees at all at the West Gate. And the thing is, this is a city at the time, it's a principality that has to be defended. It would be stupid to block your line of sight as the enemy come towards the gates. Okay, it's a bad argument. Don't use it. Oh, you're going to like this even less. Drop the woolsack argument. The idea that the Stratford monument was altered so that the woolsack the figure originally leant on was changed into a writing cushion during the renovations of 1748 or at some other time. Diana Price published on this in 1997, and what she wrote is still correct. Dugdale's 1634 sketch shows all the inaccuracies of Holler's 1656 engraving. It's very clear that Holler worked from Dugdale's sketch. This guy has got gorilla arms. He's completely out of proportion, all right? It's so obviously not an accurate representation of the monument that was in existence at that time, okay? It's just an inept drawing. I don't care how good Dugdale became as a draftsman. He wasn't good then. And not only that, maybe it was very dimly lit when he went in. He couldn't see very well. He's put, the wrong putty on. They're holding the wrong objects. So they've got their feet dangling over the side, which isn't the case. He's missed the Tudor roses engravings. He's put big cats' heads at the top of the columns when it's actually, decorative flowers. It's nothing like the thing, but it doesn't mean that it was changed. Because although the repairs were in 1748 to 9, George Virtue's much more accurate engraving, 1725, does show a cushion already in place. And the sheer number of completely pointless expensive changes is not just a matter of replacing the bust and giving him a different tunic and a different moustache, all right? The putty have been changed if they've been changed. The dimensions of it have been changed. It's been put on a wall instead of on the floor. So many pointless, expensive changes, right? It makes no sense because it would be very expensive to change those things. If you're going to change it, you just change the bust and the woolsack. The woolsack argument does not hold water. Be better scholars and say no to the woolsack argument. Okay, now I'm aware I'm going full Oxfordian here. This is a long established Oxfordian argument. And I know many of you are very attached to it, but it is built on sand. I mean, discuss it amongst yourselves. But I'm talking about in the public square, don't do it. Nash's reference to our patron, our Phoebus, is a much, much better fit. Talk about confirmation bars and things. It's a much better fit for Sir Philip Sidney, who he names in that passage, than the anonymous knight that is being assumed to be Oxford. Okay, this is a bit of a little Oxfordian myth that's been built up like Chettle's Apology in the Stratford camp. Okay, now, yes, Green did call Oxford Maecenas. He did. And he also called Sir Charles Blount, Thomas Burnaby, Robert Carey, Lord Robert Dudley, and Hugh Offaly Maecenas. It was his favourite compliment to a prospective patron. All right. I've looked into this because I've been hearing it for ages. People say, well, Marlowe wrote for Oxford. There's literally zero evidence for that. Don't say things that don't have evidence behind them. Okay. Because it just diminishes the good work that you do.
People go, well, that's obviously flawed. Therefore, everything else you say potentially is flawed. So drop the weak ones. So if you drop the weak ones, you must focus on the strong ones. What do I think are the strongest ones? Diana Price's work on literary paper trails, over 20 years old now. It's still widely unknown in the mainstream, and it still blows people's minds. And they still come back quite often with, well, it's 400 years, and isn't that true of everybody in the period? No, it's not. No, it's not. Use this stuff. It's strong. It's really strong. People need to know that it wasn't the norm for writers of that period to leave no personal, contemporaneous literary paper trail. The 6 signatures, just to look at these. For some people, just seeing these and then discovering they're the only writing we have of Shakespeare's, that can be enough, you know, to open their minds and go, okay, well, that's weird, isn't it? People assume that manuscripts exist. They don't know this is all we've got. And then when people throw hand D at you, oh yeah, but we do have a manuscript by Shakespeare. We have hand D and Sir Thomas More. It's like, do you know that comparison is made on the basis of these signatures, which no paleographer would use for a handwriting match, because signatures are a very specific kind of handwriting, and there's hardly any letters to go on anyway, right? They're clearly not fit for purpose, and hand D just falls by the wayside. Lean on them. The mismatch between the Stratford man's life and his works. You've got lots of things to choose from. I like these two. You know, sometimes you have to make a quick argument. The fact that his daughters were illiterate, it's quite powerful. It's quite powerful. He's got all these literate maids and shepherdesses. Almost anyone can turn their hand to reading or writing a letter or a poem, no matter what, you know, class they're in. And a social scientist done some work on literacy in Elizabethan England, said it's extraordinarily rare for a literate man of any social class to have illiterate daughters. And then, of course, there's the grain hoarding and Coriolanus. You know, wherever you can find a strong mismatch, I like these two, lean on those. And then there's early authorship doubt, because one of the things that's often thrown at us is no one doubted Shakespeare's works in his lifetime. Yes, they did. The strongest of them being Marston and Hall, talking about the very first 2 works published under the name Shakespeare, right? Talking about Labio, Marston paraphrases Venus and Adonis. Hall identifies 7 qualities of Labio's work, which only Shakespeare's first 2 narrative poems fit. I challenge any Stratfordian to show me any other publication from that era that fits the 7 points that Hall identifies. And of course, you know, Hall is saying Labio, like the crafty cuttlefish, has shifted responsibility onto another's name. So there we have contemporaneous evidence that people are writing under other people's names. Okay. And some of these stronger Italian evidence of Ros, the kind most unlikely to be transmissible through a conversation in a tavern, I really like the Florence triangulation. If you don't know it, then look it up, but I think a lot of you do. I love the Florence thing. I just think, come on, that is not something that you get from a chat in the pub. Now, you're not going to like this bit either, some of you, sorry. These are things that I think are really counterproductive gambits, you know, for the public square. Private conferences, no worries. I've kind of enjoyed some of the stuff that falls under this category that I've seen at this conference, but I just don't think it's taking it out there. Claiming the works of other Elizabethan writers for your favorite candidate. Claiming, for example, that your candidate also wrote the works of Thomas Nash, as if Thomas Nash isn't a real writer who socialized with others in London, wrote collaboratively with well-known writers of the period, was employed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, was at one point locked up for writing. You know, some people try to claim whole swathes of Elizabethan literature as if the Shakespeare canon were not enough, and indeed unique in its qualities. So to do this suggests that doubters have a cloth ear, that they don't know all Elizabethan literature sounds much the same. Let's grab it all under the same author. You know, let some of the other authors who actually existed have authorship of their works. Let's just focus on the Shakespeare canon. Okay. And yes, a reliance on codes, ciphers, and anagrams. I know they existed. I know John Dee existed and had ciphers, but these are never going to get taken seriously in academia or the mainstream press. They, the whole Bacon case originally folded because of ciphers. I mean, it's not that it's not going now, but it's a huge weak point. And where the change has to be made, in academia, really, for mainstream media to take everything seriously, this is a complete no-no. It's just don't go there publicly. Okay, now I've made a few enemies, but you are my friends, so I'm saying this now. So people write to me and they say they have proof and they've solved the question. And many people are still hoping to find the smoking gun. But in the absence of anything definitive, I think we have to accept this is a gradual and glacial even process. And researchers must pull threads and chip at the keystones. And here are 4 important Stratfordian threads, arguments that they've leaned on. Warwickshire dialect, they're done that's sorted. Italian ignorance, still working on that, but in progress. This is good. Playdates only really relates to the Oxfordian case, and I know loads of work has been done on that, and they really mostly ignore it. But there's still some, there was something in the what was it recently? Forgotten. One of the sort of London TLS. Thank you. That was Elizabeth, right? Yeah. So I mean, it's chipping away, pulling at the threads. And of course, Francis Smith, I love that work. I love this thing of Rogers. And it's going to be hard to get through to them, but it's there and we can build on that. So these are all valuable things. This is progress that we're making. And we can be happy about that as we get more and more people to pay attention to it. But the keystones are really hard to shift, because they absolutely rely on these. So you've already seen Chettl's apology. There's been numerous attempts, even within the Stratfordian scholars, to move that one, and they're very resistant, and the same with the upstart crow. So there have been attempts, but these ones that we're left with, this is going to bring me on. They're a bit more tricky, and this brings me on to the moot court trial of Shakespeare. Yeah, the moot court trial of Shakespeare of Stratford earlier this year, which myself and Alexander Waugh took part in as the expert witnesses for the non-Stratfordian side, and why we lost, which is all down to the one question that I'm coming to. There are actually several reasons why we lost. The Stratfordian judges and the King's councils. So there wasn't a single person, involved. That wasn't myself and Alexander, who was a non-Stratfordian. So even our own counsel, obviously, he wasn't a Sir George Greenwood, which is kind of what we would have needed, I think. They were obviously all of them leaning towards a foregone conclusion from the beginning. Also, in the last 2 minutes, the judges moved the goalposts. Okay, we agreed that we would only cover step 1, that it's all about the man from Stratford. And when they did their final judgment, the last 2 minutes, they said, since we hadn't put forward a viable alternative, they would rule against us. Yeah, I know. And there was no space or time, it was a very tight little format. There's no way you could put forward a candidate. That's why I said let's not even try and do that, because of the easy dismissals and the extra resistance and all the things I said. We all agreed at step 1, and then they said, no, let's throw that in. But there was a bigger problem as well, which was, as with much Elizabethan skullduggery, Alexander Waugh and I were invited to dinner with our counsel earlier in the week. He said it was so he could more properly represent us, understand where we were coming from and put a good argument. But having asked us for the weakest point of non-Stratfordianism, which I supplied, he fed it to the opposition. And this brings me finally to my promise that I would reduce the SAQ from 1,000 questions to 1, right? Reduce the question from 1,000 to 1. Because this is the thing that I have come to believe is our weakest point that we really need to work on. The one question that we need to answer. Hemmings and Condell. The role of John Hemmings and Henry Condell, whose first folio letter speaks of Shakespeare as a friend and fellow, and of receiving plays from him that are barely a blot, taking it as a mark of genius. Now, hard as it is to trust Ben Jonson, and we will all go, we can't trust honest Ben, all right? But we have to see it from the other side. We have to see it from the Stratfordian point of view. We have to understand where they're coming from. The entry related, to Shakespeare in Discoveries, and this folio letter, the thing that he says about the players in the text that was later published as Discoveries after his death, it suggests that he thought they were fools, but he also refers to Shakespeare as their friend, right? They are remembered as my fellows in the Stratford man's will. Now I know it's an interlineation, as though almost forgotten, right? And we could sort of cast some doubt on that, but it's hard to make that case to a Stratfordian, all right? And surely these factors mean there is personal testimony connecting the man from Stratford to the plays. Although it's posthumous in the the will was actually made while he was still alive, okay? And although the Discoveries is published posthumously, this appears to be people who knew him in his life. The Stratford man is the man that Hemmings and Condell are saying, they claim to be his friends. They believed him to be the author. In the same passage about the players, Ben Jonson makes this famous statement. To Stratfordians, both Ben Jonson and the players, Hemmings and Condell, left personal testimony, knew Shakespeare, speak of him in the same breath as the author of the works. The Stratford man, the will ties this to Stratford, okay? Now, we need to find a proper way through this question. It matters. It's the one question that the opposing KC leaned on almost entirely when making the Stratfordian case. And though we did as well as we could, we did not get anywhere near demolishing it. I would like to see a way through it, and I think we should set our minds to it. I will take questions if there's time. I bet there's not because of the technical difficulties. But if you scan this QR code, you can get access to all the things I've written on the authorship question.